thank you. Well, welcome to the Cupertino Planning Commission, Tuesday, November 27th, 2018. I call the meeting to order, and let's rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, let's take the roll call.
Chair Paulson.
Here.
Commissioner Liu.
Present.
Commissioner Takahashi.
Here.
Commissioner Sun.
Here.
Commissioner Fong.
Present. Okay. Our next item is approval of the minutes. Did you all get a chance to look at the minutes? Okay. They're short for such a long meeting, but I think the salient points are there.
I have a couple of typo items.
Yeah.
So on the bottom of page 3, there's a second line from the bottom, less. It's LES. I think it's LESS. But then there are a couple of the votes that were recorded as 401. I think that should be 410. So just wanted to, there were 3 of them.
Great, thank you.
We got those noted.
Okay. Anything else? Do I have a motion for the minutes?
Sure. I move that we approve the minutes with the correction that Commissioner Liu addressed.
Second.
Okay. All in favor? Let's see. Okay. Took me a while. It's been a while since I've used these buttons. Okay, that passes unanimously. Okay, any postponements, staff?
I don't believe there are any postponements at this time.
Okay. Oral communications. This is a time when a member of the public can speak to an item not on the agenda. We are not allowed to respond, but we will listen to you if you have something. Anyone? Okay, no? Written communications?
We are not aware of any at this point.
Okay. I did receive an email just recommending that we not have any short-term rentals, but I think you probably all received the same email. Just one email. Okay. Okay. And do we have anything on the consent calendar?
If I might interrupt 1 second.
Sure.
We do have some printouts for that particular email that you're talking about as a desk item for you as well.
Oh, okay. All
just
right.
so you have it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Any items on a consent calendar?
None at this time.
Okay. Now we have a public hearing from which I must recuse myself because my wife and I did operate an Airbnb in 2017 and for a couple months in 2018. So I will now leave and I will turn it over to Vice Chair Takahashi. Here's the cards. I'll be back.
Thanks, Jeff. No, it's different here. Okay. Oh. Voting. Yeah, I can lean
It's better
over
for him
with
to
that.
stay there because his
Yeah.
name will appear by
Right.
the vote by
Okay.
name.
So the agenda item will move first with staff report. Do we have a staff report?
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Eric Serrano with the Planning Department, presenting on the Municipal Code Amendment related to the short-term rentals. Brief background on short-term rentals. The City Council entered an agreement with Airbnb specifically regarding short-term rentals. That agreement is estimated to generate $350,000 annually. From the 2 months that we have received TOT from Airbnb, we have received close to $79,000. Council also directed staff as part of that in the 2018-19 work program to work on a regulatory framework for short-term rentals. This is an image showing the short-term rentals in Cupertino around this time last year. There are about 300 at this point in the city of Cupertino. Majority of them being Airbnb, about 94% of them. Short-term rentals have grown over time, as shown on this slide. The numbers are continuing to grow, but the exact rate is difficult to determine. There's another graph showing 3-month growth period of short-term rentals in Cupertino. Again, our Airbnb continues to be the largest platform, and these are showing those growth numbers. So some continued background. Planning Commission provided guidance to staff on potential short-term regulations on the July 24th Planning Commission meeting. The general direction was to allow STRs while protecting the long-term housing stock and preserving the quality of life of residents. Planning Commission also suggested that an online survey regarding STR regulations be conducted. Currently, the city does allow some short-term rental. Short-term rental means any legally permitted dwelling unit or portion thereof made available for rent on a transient occupant basis for short-term rental use and not considered a hotel. The current regulations require that the property owner or property leaseholder must be the primary resident at the property and must be on site during the lease period. The number of transient guests is limited to 2 or fewer guests, with the use being incidental, and must comply with the municipal code. So in preparing the short-term regulations, staff looked at a lot of different cities that had regulations, as well as those that didn't have them, but we just looked to see what was available, what was out there. So SCRs where they were regulated include Berkeley, Los Altos Hills, recently Mountain View, who just passed an ordinance earlier this month, Pacific Grove, which has just passed a measure which prohibits short-term rentals to essentially their coastal area. Pasadena, San Francisco, San Jose, Sunnyvale all have regulations regarding the short-term rentals. SCRs are now allowed in Campbell, Los Altos, Milpitas, Newark, Palo Alto, and Saratoga. And no regulations, but are allowed in Gilroy, Morgantown, Santa Clara. Los Gatos recently directed their policy committee to examine potential short-term rental regulations. So going into our proposed short-term rental standards, the short-term rentals will continue to be allowed as a home occupation in residential single-family homes, not multifamily homes. No commercial use or special uses are allowed to help minimize the impacts of short-term rentals. Hosted stays, where the property owner or leaseholder is present, will have no limitation on the number of stays, so essentially unlimited. Unhosted stays, where the property owner is not there, it would be limited to 60 days at a maximum. There would be, excuse me, one short-term rental agreement per night to help minimize impacts. The maximum number of guests would be 2 times the number of bedrooms plus 2. So if you have a three-bedroom home, 2 times 3, 6 plus 2, 8 total. Parking would be required to be consistent with the city's ordinance. So a single-family home right now would have a total of 4 parking spaces. It would only be prohibited, or permitted, I should say, in habitable areas. So no garages, no balconies, no attics, sheds, or tents. So only things that have, that are considered habitable. Each unit would be required to have a guest manual. The guest manual would have regulations discussing the noise, trash, and parking regulations for that short-term rental. And all short-term rentals will be required to display the permit on their listing. So whatever platform they do decide, the permit that's given to them by the city would be on that, so we can help verify that they are operating with that permit. So in regards to the proposed SCR application review, we are proposing an annual application so we can monitor the use as they continue. It would require proof of residency. We would require authorization would be required for any leaseholders or any properties that were in an HOA. There's also a local contact who's meant to be available in case any issues arise and provide that contact information so that they can deal with any issues quickly. There's also a consent to inspections, and again, in case any issues arise, and the application would require them to identify the parking on site. The permit findings, all required information provided, so essentially you provided everything in the application. There's no existing violations on the property. The proposed short-term rental is not considered a public nuisance or threat to the public health, safety, or welfare. And the permit may be appealed to PC and CC. So if it were to be denied or approved, there's always an appeal period or appeal process for all our applications. So enforcement is one of the things that we also looked at in preparing the regulations. So Cupertino, we always want enforcement to work with people first. We don't want to go in and just make it difficult for anybody. So we always should try to get compliance with the operator before doing anything. But in doing this, we are also proposing changes to Title I to ensure that the efficient code enforcement, essentially make it more efficient for any issues that arise. We can deal with it quicker, or code enforcement division could deal with it quicker. These items will be reviewed by the City Council. If, however, there are bad actors out there, if there's continue or really bad violations and code enforcement fails to get compliance, we have instituted a suspension pending revocation. So to go through that process, which allows for a due process, giving them the opportunity to refute the claims, but the final and allowing the director to make the final determination based off the code enforcement and the refute of complaints. Again, all decisions are appealable. So there is one item that we did add, and it's included as a desk item to the ordinance, was to add a requirement to retain records documenting compliance for 3 years, including but not limited to history of STR bookings from the STR hosting platform, records showing payment of TOT by hosting platform, or self if not collected by the hosting platform. So essentially you or something like Airbnb would show that you maintain that record. This has been applied in cities like Mountain View, Pasadena, and San Jose. As part of the regulations, we did some other cleanup to the municipal code, help with corrections and readability. Noticing noticing the public hearing, the legal ad was placed in the newspaper, a displayed ad placed in the newspaper, and the agenda posted on the city's official bulletin board and on the city's website. We also have conducted multiple next door blasts, essentially, to the public about the short-term rental. As Planning Commission directed staff, there was an online community survey between August 8th and August 26th, where 140 respondents with 97% from Cupertino residents. There were concerns regarding housing stock. Some suggested that the SCR should only be allowed in the primary residence, and there were concerns regarding parking. In addition to the online community survey, staff held a community outreach meeting on October 10th, where we mailed 25,000 postcards throughout the city. We had 26 attendees, mostly short-term rental operators. There were comments received, some regarding overregulation of the STRs, concerns over occupancy, parking regulations, and bad behavior from the short-term rentals. The project qualifies, or the ordinance update qualifies for multiple update categorical exemptions under CEQA, 15738, 1550C3, and 15305. These are just 3 different sections, essentially, that exempt the project. The fiscal impact, there would be a short-term rental permit fee associated with the permit. Staff is also looking into a third party to monitor the program and or additional staff to help with any enforcement issues. These will be items that council would consider. Next steps, Planning Commission's recommendation will be forwarded to City Council. We'll make the final decision. Our recommendation is that the Planning Commission recommend that the City Council find that the proposed actions are exempt from CEQA and adopt an ordinance with the proposed change related to record retention to regulate short-term rental activity. And that concludes the presentation. And we have staff here available to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, with that, I'll open it up to questions from the Planning Commission, and from there we'll move on to, I'll open up the public hearing, and then we'll have some discussion after that. So, questions? David?
I had a couple. So I'm curious, has there been a proposal, maybe I missed it, for the permit cost?
Not yet. Staff is looking at what it would cost us. We're cost recovery, so we're trying to really get down to the details of what that permit would cost. We are looking at other jurisdictions in terms of what fee they're currently proposing or have, but that'd be something that we take to council.
Okay. May I ask it? Yeah. So I'm curious, there's a section in there regarding a tenant who would have to seek authorization from the leaseholder or HOA. What was the, was there a strong desire to have tenants be able to initiate an STR as opposed to the person who owns the location?
Home occupations currently allow for leaseholders to have a home occupation. So it's kind of keeping in line with that principle that we currently have.
Okay. Yeah.
If I might also add to that, our current regulations also, for any permit, if you were a tenant or a leaseholder, you have to have owner authorization to represent yourself, to use that property for that particular use that you're proposing, and you have to have owner authorization for that. So this is in line with that. That the same applies to properties that are in an HOA.
Okay.
So this is the same.
And one of the requirements on the HOA, for instance, I mean, I think that's probably an example of a case where there's a high likelihood they would deny that. I mean, you know, it's been my experience at least, the HOAs would be much more likely to be control parking and other impacts. Are there limitations on their ability to approve or deny?
Not in terms of the use itself, but in general, if there are other things that, you know, they might have CCNRs, and I think our attorneys will be better able to help with that question. But in general, if there isn't enough parking, or if they might deny it on other grounds which don't necessarily pertain to the use itself.
Okay.
And I think Eric might want to add to that.
Yes, so just to elaborate, that the HOA would be, pardon me, enforcing by a private agreement, a private contract between the property owners. So their provisions that they might look at could be different than the city's, and the city isn't looking to preempt the HOA's ability to have more restrictive controls than the city would impose.
And they would expect, if you were somebody who was living in an area subject to an HOA, you would expect the decision factors to be the same, whether you're a tenant or whether you're the owner. Is that correct?
Whose decision factor? Sorry.
I mean, the HOA, in terms of whether you would get approval or not.
Yeah, and the HOA, and I'm not familiar with, obviously, with every CCNR agreement for HOAs here in the city, but the ones that I'm familiar with, those types of approvals don't distinguish between owner occupant and tenant occupant.
Okay.
They have the same rights, even though some of them will limit, for example, the number of units in an overall development that can be leased to tenants, but that's a somewhat different issue.
Any other questions, David?
I think it's probably okay for now.
Okay. Commissioner Liu?
I have a couple of clarification questions. First of all, around location, right? Because there's a clause in there about one agreement per location. So if I had a property that had a main single-family home and an ADU, Is that one location or 2 locations? Assume they have, say, different street addresses.
It's still one location. So
okay.
you could either rent out your ADU, or you could rent out a portion of your single-family home, or the
Okay.
whole thing.
And then, so if I had a duplex, then I rent out one or the other, but not both?
This is not allowed in duplex.
Oh, this is just for single?
This is just for single-family homes.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Second question then is around the number of guests. The 2 per bedroom plus 2. This is adults and children, or just adults?
It's inclusive of everybody, adults and children.
Okay, all right. The third question, the 60 days per year, is that something that a platform operator like Airbnb would help us with, or is that something we would expect the host to sort of self-enforce?
We do expect the host to self-enforce that.
Okay.
They do have to adhere to our municipal code. That's part of their permit requirements. And so we do expect there to be a third-party code enforcement, which we don't expect to actively go after people, but they can help us identify if there are issues with that. And actually, we do have Katie Nomura here. She's from our city manager's office, and she's been talking a lot with third-party host compliance people.
Okay.
And so if you have any questions related to that, maybe Katie can add something.
So the 60-day limit, or any day limit, will be more challenging to enforce. There are third-party vendors out there that can help to kind of infer and gather data, but even so, this may still be challenging. However, with appropriate backup information, we would be able to enforce on this.
All right, okay.
And if I might add, that is actually part of the purpose of adding the requirement that we proposed this evening about the records retention, because it puts the onus on the host, if there is code enforcement action, that we can look to those records and prove that, you haven't been there and you've rented out your property for more than 60 days or what have you.
Right.
So that is part of that.
Okay, that makes sense. Just one more, I think. So there are a couple of numerical thresholds, right? There's the 60-day, and then there's the 2+2. And I was wondering if staff could comment a bit on the rationale of why these numerical thresholds are set where they are. Why not 90? Why not 30? Why not? So.
I can speak to the 60-day limit. So essentially, we had multiple forms of input. As you can see from our survey results, a lot of our respondents favored a shorter window of time, even as low as 30 days. So, but looking at our other cities and best practices, a lot of the other cities go for a 90-day threshold. San Jose does have a 180 threshold. That used to be 90 that they've upped due to community input. So we settled on 60 days to be somewhere in a middle ground.
Okay, all right.
If I might add to your question about the total maximum number of guests, originally with our preliminary draft recommendations, the limit was much lower in terms of the maximum number of guests allowed. And we heard from the short-term, most of the respondents that came to the outreach meeting on October 4th were our short-term rental operators, and we did hear from them, and they did raise concerns about that maximum limit being too few. And so, which is why we kind of changed that to be what it is today. And we did look at considering whether it should be broken down by adults and children. And there were some concerns about trying to figure out, is this a child under 12? Is this show me your ID, are you under 18? We kind of got into those privacy kind of issues, and we're like, it's better to just cap it by the number of people as opposed to, are you a child or not? And that's where we ended up.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Good. Mr. Sun?
Okay, thank you. The following the 60 days, I just personal feel it's if we have a trouble to enforce it, and also it's there's going to have a trend if we're looking for much longer, maybe 2 years, 5 years later, it's the trend is going to more and more people going to have a more Airbnb. You see the number is the increase pretty fast. So I think maybe we can find some alternative there, not enforce at the 60 day. maybe 19 days, or it's just some losing number there. So it's keep the regulation more flexible. That's the maybe one option. The second is the question is I think it's for the hotel industry and the Airbnb industry. It is becoming very, very competitive to the commercial use, and also this the Airbnb is the most happened in the residential areas. So it's when there is a conflict about the zoning, we give something like an exception for the zoning. So in that part, it's any regulation like a fire alarm, those kind of a safety regulation, maybe we can add it to the Airbnb, the housing, give them a more security enforcement and make sure there is no the safety issue happen, especially for the fire disasters. Those kind of things is how we regulate this part. Just compare the hotel regulation and the cost they have to pay.
So, I mean, because these are residential homes, they're different codes. They're different building codes that apply to hotels and different ones that apply to residential homes. But every house does have to have, every bedroom has to have exiting. They're in terms of regulations related to fires and other safety regulations, there's a residential building code that applies to those.
So there's no extra regulation just in terms of fire safety. There is no difference between the residential and the hotel.
I think Eric would like to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing extra in our ordinance, but the big thing that we did make clear in the ordinance was habitable spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want these to be, in the garage or in a shed or anything like that. We want to make sure that these occur in structures where there was a building code in place that does meet those necessary requirements, of egress and exiting, that kind of stuff. So that's why we were specific to that language.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do see your point, and we're happy to have another chat with our fire department to see if there is something that should be added, and we can certainly look at that as well.
Because the tenant is different with the homeowner. Tenant is more intent just to stay there. They don't care the property and pay less attention to the disaster stuff. Those kind of they say, oh, it's insurance covered. So it's probably we put a more restriction, or it's the burden to make sure the house safety is, otherwise it's going to, if have burn, it's going to affect the entire community, those kind of things. Maybe we can learn something from fire department.
Sure, we can have that conversation.
Okay, the next one is about I think the primary residence. So far, my understanding is that we only allow Airbnb, the short-term rentals business in the primary residence. Is that correct? So the people, if they have their own house, but they buy the second or third, just use the Airbnb purpose. For the Cupertino, we don't allow it.
That is correct. That is what we overwhelmingly heard from our community, was not to allow Airbnbs everywhere. And so the whole purpose of this was to allow it as an incidental use. This is not a standalone use. That what you're referring to would be a hotel in a residential neighborhood, and that is not an allowed land use in the residential neighborhoods.
Okay.
This is particularly for short-term rentals.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple questions. Third-party enforcement. So there's obviously a fee associated with that. Is recovering of that fee through the STR costs, and that comes back, or is it part of permitting, or how do we recover the third-party enforcement costs?
So right now, the way that it's been envisioned is that due to the additional TOT that's being collected through this STR process, that we would be able to pay for the third-party costs. Okay, so I guess I would feel that it would be appropriate potentially to increase the TOT. I don't know what that third-party cost is, but it's based on estimates we've received so far. It's adequate, more than adequate so far.
Right, but I don't think we want to forfeit all of our TOT to pay for third-party enforcement.
Right, and I don't think it'll be
Okay.
at that level. Once we kind of get a contract set up, we can get those costs more formalized, but
Right.
I don't anticipate that
Any
to be
precedents
most of it.
for municipalities requiring essentially that fee to be passed on to as any extra burden or cost to the,
So we are actually looking into that
Okay.
to see whether there can be cost recovery for code
Right.
enforcement,
Okay.
time and staff efforts. I believe the government code restricts us in certain ways to
Mhm.
how costs can be costs can be recouped, but and there's certain limitations on administrative citations, penalties, and certain things
Okay.
like that. So we're looking into all of that, and all of that will be wrapped into the Title I changes that that Eric alluded to earlier.
okay. Do we have any data from, because clearly you guys did a lot of work in terms of understanding what other cities are doing, but how effective third-party enforcement actually is? Because the only reason I ask this is I know the first time we went through this, it was an incredibly tiny percentage of actual hosts that had permits. So you had pretty much, and really don't know how much of it was just awareness versus a willful not getting a permit. So curious, how effective is third-party enforcement, do we believe?
I would say at the very beginning, when we were setting the program up, there will probably be a lot more compliance and effectiveness, because identifying people that don't have a permit would be easier, and there are 300 short-term rentals out
Right.
there right now. So you'd see a big jump in terms of percentage for
Sure.
identification and compliance.
Right.
But as time goes on, it's certainly
Right.
going to get, because we're expecting that people will be aware and will be compliant and permitted. So
Okay.
there will be a big rise and then possibly a flattening out.
Right, because again, going back, the host would not participate in any element of enforcement, correct? I'm sorry, not the host, the Airbnb, for example, the online broker.
I don't believe that the
Right.
hosting platform will be part of this.
Right.
My understanding is that they have actually declined to participate in any
Sure.
enforcement. It is business for them, so
Right, so,
it would be up to us.
okay. I guess my concern is we have no idea how effective a third-party enforcement is. Is it 10%? Is it, what's the cycle time associated with how often they check? Are Airbnb records in perpetuity? Can we go back and look over the past 6 months? This residence rented 3 times. Third part, how does, I guess I'm not
Right.
quite.
Right. So it really depends on which vendor we end up going with, but some of what's available out there is they can do daily data gathering,
Okay.
and so once the contract's in place, they can then start a record of every listing that's been going on and try to identify what address that is, because that's one of the hardest parts for
Right.
the city, is because the address is not readily available, and so that's a big piece. They provide a lot of data and information. As far as boots on the ground enforcement, if something requires code enforcement action, that would be the city staff still.
Okay.
But the third-party vendor would send out a letter notifying people. I did have a conversation with one of the potential vendors today to ask how effective is it just based on your letters. And the way he explained it was, if you think about compliance and when we receive a complaint or an issue, how and them coming into compliance. He said about 65% just based on notification, just based on them sending out the letter to let the person know that, hey, you need to come into compliance. And it just goes up from there, because there's additional, interactions that occur. And of course, if our code enforcement staff gets involved, their compliance rates would go up. If that's a good, it's just kind of a starting place, because I understand
Right,
that.
but the letter comes from the third party.
Right. To kind of take that burden off of city staff.
Sure, I understand that, which makes sense, except then I would think that would not quite be as effective as a letter coming from the city that says, hey, you're not in compliance.
Well, we would work together to make sure that that messaging is clear, that this is
This
a
is
vendor of the
also-
city.
Right,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
We don't anticipate that it'll be a letter on a sheet of white paper. We're hoping that we can put the
when you
weight
get
of
a
the
letter,
city
it's like,
behind it.
who's this, right?
Right,
And then,
right. Yeah, use up your
Right.
your miles before they
Right.
expire.
So
kind of thing.
I'm just-
We're-
talking through how this works then. So they pick up over some frequency of time that there's been a residence, an address that has rented done a STR, but hasn't, does not have the license, right? So they send the letter. There's some period of time, and then if they continue without responding, we get notified, the city gets notified that, hey, this has gone to escalated twice, and we think enforcement is needed. Is that kind of how the process would work?
We can specify kind of what kind of arrangement we would like, but yes, generally speaking, that's kind of how it would be set up. Another feature that some of them offer is they would monitor a 24/7 hotline for complaints and to collect those and gather more information, make sure that when our code enforcement does get involved, they have all the pertinent information that's available.
Okay. All right, and all of this is outside of the Airbnb software, for example, so they're not aware of any of this, right? And that person can continue to rent until, I guess, the worst case scenario, what we take legal action against that, right?
So maybe I can help with that a little
Sure.
bit. So what happens is, at least this is what
Sure.
my understanding
Yeah.
is. So the third-party vendor would identify an issue, would send out the letter. When it gets referred to the city, every violation, every day that they rent that
Okay, there's
property
a
is
fee,
a violation, and there
a
is an
penalty.
administrative a citation that could be issued
Right.
for every day that it gets rented, once that code violation is identified.
Okay.
The way to get compliance I've been told, is to hit the pocketbooks essentially, because there's really no
Yeah,
other
sure.
mechanism of preventing
Right.
listing of that site. And even that, with that, it is my understanding that there is enough money in this business that they may not care, because the citation amounts, which are set by the government code, are not high enough. But however, we did write into the code a revocation mechanism, so we can revoke a permit if
okay.
it does get to that point. Again,
Right,
you
but
know,
now you're in
we-
the whole same,
yeah.
right? I mean, so now they've got their permit revoked, but since Airbnb is doing zero enforcement, they can say, hey, you got a place still.
Right, and so as Eric does point out, if it does become a public nuisance to that point where they're egregiously violating the code, then it can be declared a public nuisance and it can be abated, and there
Okay.
can be other, and in that case, once it's declared a public nuisance, there are other mechanisms. Then you can
Sure,
get to
okay.
court. It can be up to a misdemeanor. Right now, I think
Right,
our code
okay.
calls it an infraction, but it can be a misdemeanor. You can be taken to jail, I guess, if it's a misdemeanor.
Right.
So
So-
Commissioner, if I may,
Sure.
I've done a lot of code enforcement in the past, and you're keen on the issues here. Enforcement is very difficult for this type of violations, permitting violations. I do think, as I hear you ask questions, that there are a couple of things that we can do and the city should consider, and I'll be happy to work with staff, and
Okay.
Eric will do the same. But one of them would be that you notify Airbnb that we have
Right.
a chronic violator,
Right.
and that we would like them to not include them as part of their program. They may decline to do that, but I think it's a good effort on the part of the city. Public nuisance can be also litigated. It's very difficult to prove that this kind of
Right.
violations. But certainly a letter from the city attorney, if it gets to that level
Sure.
of elevation, might,
Yeah.
attract
Agreed.
more attention on the violators. So,
Okay.
but I think you're honing in on the difficult enforcement issues.
Right, okay. Okay, that's all the question I have. Commissioner?
Actually, if I could follow up on something that Commissioner Takahashi raised, is there something that prevents the cost of the third-party enforcement? Is there something that prevents the permit fee from covering that, independently of the TOT that's
So
collected?
there is a possibility of having an enforcement fee. Some cities do that. Many cities have a placeholder language in their code that says council may adopt a fee by resolution, but don't currently adopt one. That is something we could consider doing.
If the fee has not been determined and there's an opportunity, there's a goal, of cost recovery for the administrative portion, you could view the a third-party enforcement vendor to be part of that administration.
Correct, and that is part of what we're going to be looking at when we do take that fee to
Yeah.
council.
I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the there was a comment about, the TO2 could cover that, but that actually reduces the revenue coming to the city as a result. And that's different than the situation from a hotel.
Well, correct, but up until, it was 2 months ago, we
Yeah.
were doing code enforcement
Right.
and we were not collecting the
Right.
TOT either.
Right. Thank you.
Sherlyn?
There's just two more questions. One is around parking. So right now, the draft requirements say that the site has to have minimum spots as required by the zoning district. Are these, do these need to be empty spots, or can the owner who's renting them out fill it with their car? And so I'm just wondering, is it just spots in general or empty spots?
So they have to designate at least one spot. For
Empty
a short-
spot.
Right,
Okay.
as for short-term rental parking.
Okay.
We did consider whether we wanted to allow parking on the streets and write that into the code, or, at minimum have so many street parking available. However, we did realize when we looked through the survey results that there were a lot of community members that did comment on parking, rightfully so, that parking is a shared facility, and it should be available to everybody, and it should not be designated for certain uses, regardless of whether, that's your frontage or not. We did see value in that comment, in those comments, and so we wanted to keep that parking on site.
Sorry, just a clarification. So the comments were for allowing the tenants to park on the street or not park on the
It
street?
kind of went a little bit both ways,
Okay.
but most of the comments were not to allow them on the
Right.
street. And so that's why we intentionally went with saying
On
you
site.
have to designate one spot on site.
All right.
As
Okay.
that. And then, there's on-street parking available for other uses in
Right.
any case.
All right. And then my other question is around this notion of a local contact that needs to reply, I guess, or respond within 60 minutes. So two questions. One, how would the neighbors find out what this local contact number is? And then two, if the complaint's at 2 in the morning, they still need to respond within 60 minutes?
So for the first part of that question, so the city will maintain that database.
Okay.
We're looking to see whether we can make that available on our website so that it's available there. We're kind of looking at options right now.
Okay.
Honestly, we haven't, those are the administrative kind of things that we're looking at of
Okay.
how to implement this. And in terms of if somebody calls at 2 a.m., yes, it's still 60 minutes for them to respond, and that is the responsibility that the host is imposing on that local host.
Okay,
Or the
great.
local contact.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Couple of follow-up questions, pretty, I think, straightforward. You said the TOT so far was
79,000.
79,000 over what period of time?
2 months.
2 months. And we had originally estimated what?
300 over the year, 350
Okay.
over the year.
So we woefully underestimated the
It
revenue.
would seem so,
Based on usage, essentially, right? I would
Correct.
assume.
correct.
TOT is based strictly on nights stayed in, right, in per. or
Correct, it's
as
per
a,
rental,
as a percentage of the rental fee,
correct.
right?
12%? It's 12% of the nightly rate.
Okay. And so that's the one thing Airbnb is willing to do, right? So we expect 100% of the TOT of anybody that is.
We're expecting 94%
94?
of of what we have currently in the city. 94% of the rental of the Airbnb stock in the city to pay the TOT, because about 94% of the rentals are through Airbnb. However, 6% are either VRBO or
VRBO,
some other hosting platform.
And
For
they,
those hosts, we expect them to collect that TOT and transmit it to the city,
okay,
and that is a municipal code requirement.
okay. But that has not taken place yet in terms of them
That
agreeing.
should be taking place, though that mechanism is already in
Okay,
place. They
alright.
should be collecting it and they should be transmitting it. Whether they are or not is a completely different issue, but there's no good way for us to verify that at this point because we don't even have the permitting
Right.
in place
Sure.
at this time.
Okay. Going back to the quantity of people, how did that compare to a lot of the other, I don't remember how that compared to the other local municipalities? The 2 plus 2 plus, the 2 per room plus 2.
I think Katie and Eric can
Okay.
answer that question.
In Sunnyvale, they say 4 guests per night, not including accompanying minors. In San Jose, they actually define it based on the dwelling type. So host present single family is 3. Host present multifamily is 2 per dwelling unit. Host not present is 2 per studio, 3 for the, and then if it's not a studio, 3 for the first bedroom and 2 for subsequent rooms up to a 10 maximum of occupants. Pasadena has 2 guests per room plus 2, similar to ours. However, theirs is, I believe it's per room, where ours is, we're setting a maximum rather than designating how many in each room. And then Pacific Grove has 2 guests per room plus 1.
Thanks. Any other questions from the commission? Okay, at this point I will open up the public element of this agenda item. Our first speaker is Jennifer Griffin.
Good evening, Planning Commission. I'm Jennifer Griffin. I did do the online survey, and I went to both of the city meetings on this. And it's interesting because when you all were talking about having an on-site host and having someone, if it's 2 a.m. and you have to do they have 60 minutes to get the contact? My husband and I went to Virginia in September, and we came back into San Francisco at 10 o'clock at night, and we took Super Shuttle, and we picked up a nice lady from the San Francisco airport who was going to an Airbnb in Palo Alto. And it was 10 o'clock at night. Well, 2 hours later, we got home because the poor woman, the property had been advertised as having a gatekeeper, and we were deep into a property off of El Camino. Pitch dark, there was no one there and she didn't have a phone number. All she had was an email address. So the driver kept driving around and trying to find places to put her off, but it was 11 o'clock at night. It was, you know how that is. But it couldn't have been more appropriate. But of course, we wanted to make sure that the lady, she'd never been in California before. I don't know why she was doing this, but eventually she got a woman, but she had to email her, and we spent an hour circling El Camino in Palo Alto. So I'm just saying, I think it's very important, especially with this older lady, that we have hosts that are responsible and are there and available, and having a phone number. Don't misrepresent the property, because you may have people coming from out of state. So I'm sure in that situation, I think having the third-party contractor that the city is talking about, being able to have access to phone numbers. I have another one. I have a family member who has an Airbnb around the corner that city sent out notices to all the neighbors. This was a couple months ago, that there was an Airbnb going in and that there was a permit that was going to be issued. It had all the contact numbers. And I think that was an interesting way of handling it. But I think the third party is a really good way to go. I'm also concerned about people from other countries taking properties in California to smoke marijuana on site. I think Canada doesn't allow marijuana, but people are coming here to smoke it. I don't know that much about it, but I don't think Airbnb really condones it, but it is a problem. In that situation, I think we need to make sure that we don't present problems for the neighborhoods, and that if this is going to be something the city does, we want to do it well and responsibly. But I certainly, as a homeowner, I think that the neighbors need to know where the Airbnbs are. So if there is an emergency, you can contact someone. Or if the house is being held up, I mean, I don't know, there was a video problem where the house was being
Jennifer,
held
you need
up.
to wrap up here.
And the neighbors called the police because they didn't realize there were Airbnb people going in there. Anyway, thank you.
Our next speaker, I have only have 2 cards, so if you do want to speak, please fill out a card. Kitty Moore.
Hi, good evening, Planning Commission. So I was curious what it would cost if you wanted to get a hotel room tonight in Cupertino, and I found one at $401 and another at $649. And that was off of Expedia. I was shocked. So I can see why there's a market for the Airbnbs here, definitely. But looking at Expedia, I was alarmed to see a single-family residential home near mine, 1,600 square feet, also available, which is taking that house off of the market for long-term rentals and families that might want to be there. And they were also renting out their ADU at that same place. So that would mean that there's no on-site owner, and that whole house in a nice area is taken off the market. And my other concern is, you know, we have a housing shortage, and these short-term rentals are taking the long-term housing stock away. And not only is that happening, but you have, you know, the families can't bring their kids into our schools here. And the Airbnb map that you showed had a lot of homes in the Monte Vista area, for instance, which has declining enrollment. So it's going to have some other impacts. You've also got some lost revenue in the hotel industry because you're gonna have people that are going to the Airbnb rather than paying the $400 to $600. And so it seems like we have a hotel shortage here. And another issue is that there aren't the short-term rentals allowed in Campbell and Los Altos and Saratoga. So we're probably, with that trajectory of the increase of Airbnbs, maybe we're just seeing the start of it. Because if they're not allowed in Saratoga, people aren't going to be able to stay there, and they're going to come to Cupertino, and that increases the demand. So I also disagree with increasing the number of occupants from the earlier version that you had. So a 4-bedroom house in my neighborhood is about 1,400 square feet, and you're talking about putting 10 people in that house. And usually, you know, if it's actually a family living there, they've got at most 6 people, and that's even, you know, a multi-generational family. So I'm concerned about having 10 people in these houses. And in my neighborhood, they're actually, it's called an 8-minute house because they burn so quickly. Yeah. Yeah, so I can't recall who brought up the fire issue, but that really is a concern. Yeah, it's a protected neighborhood in Cupertino. So I think there's some more details to be worked out to make this really work and not cause us more problems in the long term. Thanks.
Thank you, Kitty. Okay, at this point, I will close the public comment. And we can entertain any further questions for either staff or other commissioners on this matter. Any other questions or points of discussion?
Do we have any information on what the cost of an average rental in Cupertino is versus the cost of renting a house? I'm basically trying to understand, you know, just from a numerical standpoint, that differential. If I were a house owner and I leased it versus doing this Airbnb thing and rented it out night by night, what the difference is? Because I've seen some studies online for other cities that were a few years back, but I didn't know if we had anything like that for Cupertino.
I don't believe we have that data at this point. We did ask in our survey how much rental income was coming into short-term operators, and most chose not to respond to it. However, we did get 3 responses. 2 said that they made between $1,000 and $2,000 a month, and the third said he made between $2,000 and $3,000 a month. He or she made between $2,000 and $3,000.
So can we? So earlier you said in the 2 months we've collected, was it $79K in TOT, right? So that's, let's say 80 times 6. We're looking at about $500,000 a year. Then you showed about 300 listings in Cupertino. So roughly back of the envelope, I'm thinking 500,000 divided by 300 is probably the average take with that.
I guess you could,
Sure.
you could say that.
I can say anything I
Yeah.
want? All right.
It's theoretical, but sure.
Sure, okay, thanks.
Actually,
Commissioner Fun?
I wonder, you probably wouldn't want that, again, without knowing, it's impossible to say, but I think that you're probably going to find higher revenue in, a smaller number of them, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah. That actually would be the case of, there are going to be some people who are just occasional.
This is a question mainly spurned by what Kitty Moore asked or brought up, and that is it possible to cap the total number of units?
So have a total number of
Right. So
short-term
whenever
rental
you see a growth curve that somewhat looks exponential, right? You really don't know what the future looks like, and if you were if it followed an exponential growth based on continued pressures and our inability to build hotels, which is clearly an issue from the standpoint of supply side on the hotel side. You could see that continuing to grow exponentially, in which case it becomes a significant income stream from TOT, which that's not a bad thing, but I think there's potentially a broader impact here of it becoming something we can't control necessarily, and or is because it's I think the Valley is a special area for many reasons, and the property values are a big part of that, and creating a lot of unintended consequences with regard to all kinds of things. So I guess I wonder, is that worth discussion? Some level of cap that can be, that we can then modify or change as needed if we don't feel like it's a problem. But at some point, I think that might be, just looking at that curve, something that we may have to consider.
So if I might add to that,
Sure.
I mean, the way that we're imagining this is that you as a homeowner can rent a couple of rooms in your house as a short-term rental,
Sure.
unlimited.
Yep.
And you as a homeowner, if you're traveling or something like that, you have 60 days in a year in which you can rent that property.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily taking housing units off of the long-term housing, like it's not.
Right, I'm not
housing
necessarily
stock.
even correlating it with the long-term housing
Okay.
impact
So
as
maybe I
much as
misunderstood.
that we've got 10 houses on a block and 9 are now somewhat regularly hosting. Is that something we're worried about? I'm just throwing it out there for discussion.
Maybe, yeah. Another way to look at that is that the allocation of hotel rooms in the city is limited.
Mm-hmm.
And so that actually raises the question of perhaps you want to consider imposing a limit on the number of permits.
Right, that's exactly what I was talking about. And not only is the hotel limited, but we're adding a lot more office. That just completely puts fuel on the fire with regard to demand for short-term rentals.
I will say this, we do have 2 hotels in our pipeline at this point.
Yep.
There are 2 hotels or 3 hotels in San Jose's pipeline just outside of our borders as well. Just informationally.
Yeah,
just wanted to be
$600 a
aware.
night is very accurate. I can attest to that.
Right. So there are about 5 hotels in the pipeline in this vicinity as we speak. However, with that said, I'm just looking to Katie to see, do many cities have a cap on the number?
From not from what we were able to find,
Right.
Pacific Grove was the one.
Yeah, so I did want to mention Pacific Grove. They had a cap of 249 short-term rental units. They do have other vacation homes and other types of tourist rentals
Okay.
that they have in their town as well, in addition to the short-term rental program that they had. However, they issued, I believe, more permits than the cap inadvertently.
So they didn't actually enforce their cap effectively.
it somewhere slipped.
Yeah.
And eventually they had to
Move the cap.
No, actually, what they ended up doing was they instituted a lottery to figure out who gets to keep it and who doesn't.
Okay.
And that became a very big issue in terms of the community. It was a very divisive issue. Eventually, it ended up with being a ballot measure in November, in which they prohibited short-term rentals entirely in most of the city, except in their local coastal plan area.
Okay.
Because you can't have an ordinance that conflicts with the local coastal plan. So they do allow short-term rentals in the local coastal plan area right now, but I believe they're looking at that as well with review of the local coastal plan to see whether they can eliminate that from that area as well. But they do have other vacation rentals. Tourism is is a big part of what they do. And so they do have another category which does allow rentals for transit rentals, essentially. So this was in addition to that. So yes, you can potentially institute a cap, and
Just thought it was
that's the commission's recommendation.
worth some discussion.
We will certainly take that to the council.
One other point I wanted to just see if there's other opinions on the commission, and if it's worthy of discussion, is the number of occupants. There's a huge variety. And how comfortable are we with what's currently proposed versus recommending an alternative?
I think we're talking about the two caps. One is about the total number in the city.
The number, I think everybody feels there has to be a number on the number of occupants because
the number of occupants is
chaos, right?
For each residence, we impose is per room is 2 person. So it's whether it's we're going to discuss whether it's we have a cap, like a maximum per residence is going to have a 10, 8, those kind of a cap, right? That's the one thing. I think it's open for us to discuss. The second one is you just mentioned about the entire city, whether we should have a limitation for the entire short-term rental. It's for the second one. I think it's a little bit too early. We just put a cap there because for the entire city we have so many residents. So far, if we put a cap, it looks like just a very roughly guess number. So it's there's no base for us to estimate how fast the market is going to grow. So
it's only going to grow.
Yeah, we
know that.
Yeah, so that's the one thing is my incline. For the second one is that I think it's market is maybe they can automatically adjust per residence, because so far it's if people they're looking for short term, the income, the mostly is just a regular guy. They cannot have a 5-bedroom or 10-bedroom to just run out. So it's, if they put a cap there, it's okay, but it wouldn't generate too much impact because the market is going to automatically adjust. The very rich people, they have a 10-bedroom, probably they don't want to run out for 20 people to stay there, right? That's my just the guess. But overall, it's I don't against if we put a cap there. Just looks good. Yeah, but it's in reality, whether it's a very effective way to regulate the market or not, it's I'm pretty open on this one. If people, we all agree to put 10 people there and make a community more comfortable, that's fine with me. But I don't just say it's not very necessary to put. I prefer the regulation as less as possible. I think Airbnb, they have this market. Most people, they want to treat their tenant good, and they want to get a review good. So it's many issues we concern. Actually, it's the homeowner or the renter.
Right, somewhat
they're going to self-regulate it. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just share my thoughts on these two issues real quick. I think on the first one, in terms of an overall cap, I agree with Commissioner Sun. I think it's too early. I think at some point you do want to have some kind of cap, but I think we're early enough in this life cycle here to even know what that cap is. So I would agree that probably not at this juncture. In terms of the maximum number of occupants, I'm not comfortable with this linear 2n plus 2. I think probably for some of the reasons that Commissioner Takahashi is bringing up, it's just you could get these sort of. I agree with you. I think that there's going to be some market forces to mitigate this, and at the same time, I see having some sort of a cap there would be good for sort of an enforcement mechanism. So I don't know if it's necessarily an absolute cap like 10 or 8, or if we do something by the square foot of the property. But so just sort of a 2n plus 2, it feels a little, the allowable maximum seems a little bit high for me.
So I would agree. I think that I wonder whether we might consider raising the issue about a permit cap or overall cap. Right now, if you're talking about 300 units, I think there's 18,000 homes here.
Yep.
So the percentage is very low, and I think it would be very difficult to guess at what an impactful number is. So, but I think that raising that as a consideration without necessarily attaching a number might be something we consider doing. I actually am concerned more about on the small side rather than the large side for the
Number of
for the occupancy. I think that the problem is for a business traveler who, if you work for a company that didn't, well, I actually discussed this with the staff yesterday. If you work for a company that didn't want to spend, $2,000 a night to send 4 people out, they may look for a house, right? They may look for a house or they may look for rooms. And those are actually the cases where you have, a number of people and possibly a bunch of cars, right? So I think that, and I also am a little concerned about the 2n plus 2 model, for instance. With a 4-bedroom house, that's 10 people. That's probably quite a lot more than you would have in in a home that was owner occupied,
Right.
or even a long-term rental. So that may or may not be true, that last part. But so I also have the feeling that perhaps that number is a little high. And I kind of felt, one of the things I raised with the staff when we discussed this yesterday was to consider should that number be different if you have kids rather than adults. And I think one of the things they brought up that I think is very fair is that it's very difficult.
Yeah, another
It's very difficult for the operator as well to validate that. I mean, you can put in the listing you're only allowed to have 2 people here, 3 people here, 4 people here. They're going to be the people who come there are going to violate it anyway, and this becomes a problem of accounting. It's also a problem of, if you say you can have 4 people in one room, but some of them have to be kids. Very, very difficult to enforce. So, rather than trying to make something that isn't workable, it would be nice to seek a number. I don't know whether that means there's an absolute limit that we come to before, and that doesn't help on the small side. So I'm not sure the best way to approach this as well. But I generally have the sense that I feel like the calculation is probably a little erring toward the high side.
Right, so if we've got 3 of us, at least, that are thinking it's on the high side, the compromise seems to me is recommend just 2n and strike the plus 2.
2n fixes the small rentals well. It makes it difficult for a family or that kind of thing. But
3-bed house. Now you're talking about 6 versus 8.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's one of the other pieces. I think there have been a number of places here where the information that we capture, there's definitely some interesting things there about the amount of money, the amount of nights that an operator is using their facility, the amount of revenue that they're generating, the number of people that are there, and the mix of whether they are, to the extent that they can know adults and kids. Those may be things that, as part of the reporting requirements, that would be useful to capture.
Right.
But Commissioner,
I have just one more thing is, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondering that Commissioner David Fung just mentioned the concern about the small numbers on that side. If there is a per contract per night, is going to play some rules there to help you to solve the issue instead of we impose some regulation there. suppose one premier is every per night, they only allow one contract out instead of a 5-bedroom give to 5 different parties,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's true.
So it's a,
So
it's
we
you
do,
don't
we do
need-
have that limitation currently, so
Yeah.
the one.
So in that case, if a single business people, they travel to Cupertino, they only looking for maybe studio or 1 bedroom. They're not going
Right,
to go to the.
I think Commissioner
Yeah.
Fung was thinking of a case where if you got a team of 4 auditors, for example, that are from the same company, and they're going to the same company, and so you're looking at $3,000 worth of hotel rooms,
Yeah, yeah.
or $500 per night at a person's house, and they want them all to have their own bedroom, so they're going to go with a 4-bedroom place. Are they all renting their own cars? And
Yeah.
that's the situation that.
So-
I'm afraid that one's actually, the
Happening.
problem is that there are a lot of people who come to work with people at Apple, and
Yeah.
a lot of companies who don't have as much money as Apple. So, that is the challenge, that those are the places where it's the alternative. It's a startup that sends, hey, we're going to send 4 people there, but we're not going to rent 4 hotel rooms.
So
Right.
the impact is going to be the traffic parking, or what's the
think so.
negative
More
I think
impact
so.
parking,
to the-
probably.
I think
Yeah.
that a lot of the character of what the ordinance is trying to capture is that it's making it possible for you to have the right to have a short-term rental without turning it into the right for you to have a commercial operation in a residential space, right? And that's, so when you start getting into these things where, it's very high intensity of use, those are the things which, I think it's been generally effective in limiting. It's just a matter of figuring out, what are the right numbers to make it happen that way. I think that, I suspect, certainly if somebody owns a house with the intent of Airbnb-ing it, this is a very difficult ordinance for them.
One last question I have is on liability from the standpoint of owner / let's say it's owner, occupied, and the customer, and they are violating any elements of what we'd set forth. Responsibility comes back to the owner, right? However, the owner, when you look at the application that the applicant applied for, they said, no, there's only going to be 4 people. I got a whole bunch of friends that decided to come at the last minute. How does that, is there precedence from a legal standpoint as to who and what, how that all gets sorted out? Because just going back to potential, enforcement and just curious.
Well, the way the ordinance is drafted is that it's enforced against the
Strictly
property
against
owner
the
or the
property owner.
tenant
Right.
that's hosting, and then it would be up to the terms of service that they have with their guests if they have any opportunity to
recover.
get indemnity or claw that back based on violation of their rental agreement that they had with
Right.
their
So it'll be in the
guests.
terms and conditions associated with the.
Between the two private parties,
Right,
but as
right.
far as the city's concerned, they're going after the property
Yep,
owner
okay.
for the means of enforcing it.
If I might add to that, what we were also thinking is when, to create some sort of a tenant sheet, essentially, that essentially goes to the tenant with the rental agreement. This is just part
Oh,
of
I
the
see.
administrative rules and stuff that basically say, you can have a maximum of these many guests, and, for the tenant to read and acknowledge that I understand these are the rules, and I looked at them and I initial it, and that kind of stays in part of the records for the,
And that's
with the-
administered by the owner or
Yes,
the?
it's administered by the owner. And we would prepare like a generic, here are rules
Right.
and conditions, and these are
Okay,
what the city requires, and the tenant
Sure.
would have to sign
Okay.
off on it and get that acknowledgement.
all right.
Can I jump in one question to city staff? So it's when we're talking about the code or municipal regulations, how close are we working with Airbnb directly to get some advice from them? Because they have so many experience, so much varieties. I think they can give us some like a template, something like that. So it's at least we have some reference there based on our population, the income level, and then it's we don't need to talk here to predict so many the uncertainty. I think it's the Airbnb, they may have some all kind of scenario they have go through already. So it's how close we're working with them on this part.
So as it was alluded to a little earlier, Airbnb wants to stay a little bit away from our regulatory process.
Oh, okay.
However, we did catch their attention, and we were able to have a few conversations with them about what we were thinking and their input on that. Generally speaking, they were just giving, like you were saying, their experiences, and it wasn't anything too off from what we've kind of considered when we were developing these regulations. I think one of the things that they were particularly concerned about, but I think this is mostly driven by their business model, was limiting it to single-family homes and how they thought you should offer it to everyone. But again, that may be influenced by their financial decisions.
One quick question on just enforcement with Airbnb is some of the cities where it's not allowed. So if I went on Airbnb and type Saratoga, I'm not going to see anything in Saratoga. Is that a true statement? I've never tried it.
No, I actually just tried it when we were talking.
Yep.
I found a few right off the bat.
Okay. Curious. All right. You can read my mind. Any other things you guys want to discuss?
So one of the things I'm curious, we don't address in the revocation wording here, we don't address, egregious violation versus there are too many cars parked on the street. And I don't know whether that, again, a reference, I did have a discussion with the staff about this, about the, there's some verbiage there which is effectively a streamlining of the decision-making process around the permit and permit revocation. So I don't know whether that's something that people want to consider. If somebody, the problem that you don't want to have is that somebody the operator of an Airbnb has somebody comes to use it and has a giant party, a giant wild party, right? And that the wording here does allow the city to act very quickly. I mean, it's a code enforcement thing first, but can act more quickly in that particular kind of case. Now, the flip side of that is somebody who's regularly having a problem where there are 2 cars coming instead of 1, or 5 people instead of 4. And I don't know, again, maybe this is a non-issue because, if this is handled through code enforcement action, you're getting a letter that's saying, hey, there's a problem here. The host only has so much ability to control how many, they can tell people they should only bring 1 car, but they can't make that.
I'm sure it's in the terms and conditions in terms of what you're allowed to do. So I would.
So I don't know whether that's something that we ought to discuss. It may not be something that can be handled smoothly, but I just want to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
I think parking is one of those things. I've been neighbors with folks that do short-term rentals, and so when times come when they rent to folks that bring a lot of vehicles, it really impacts the neighborhood. And so right now the draft requirements here talk about more on the supply side, right? You must have this much space available. So to follow up on what Commissioner Fung said, should we, I'd be up for discussion on sort of maybe the other side of it. How many cars could you bring in? Is that something that's viable? That
It's hard to enforce, right? So for the
well, no, it's not. No, I actually wouldn't, because it's pretty obvious when there are new cars in the street that there's 4 cars where there used to be 0, right? So I actually think cars are easier to enforce than people because they're sitting out there. So yeah,
but they can park cars like 1 block away
in the garage, or if they have access to the
50
garage.
feet away. It's very hard. You can identify this guy is working.
Well, we actually
100
can, but
feet.
I see your point.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
It's very hard to enforce. Yeah.
Right.
Can you remind us what the other municipalities have done with regard to parking and limits of cars? I think that was on the table, but I can't remember. And I could pull it up here, actually.
It is, but I'll read it for you. So in In Los Altos, they have all STR parking must be provided on-site in approved parking areas. San Jose had language indicating that on-site parking per their zoning requirements. Pasadena had parking shall be provided on-site. Again, Pacific Grove, parking shall be provided on-site as designated, probably during their application process. But again, like the way that it is worded, it doesn't necessarily prohibit from on-street parking necessarily.
Sure. And I can imagine an owner moving, right, I understand. I see your point. But I think the language basically at least saying that there needs to be parking on site at least gives us a little bit of a stick so that it's not too egregious. Yeah. Okay.
And, oh, go ahead.
The other way that some jurisdictions will enforce is by having on-street parking permits, neighborhood parking regulations. Right. So if parking in a particular area really is constrained and an issue, there's other mechanisms to address that as well that are a little easier to enforce than getting at it through an ordinance like this.
That's a good point.
Right.
Okay,
And just to
I actually was, so in raising the issue about parking, because I think that actually will be the first thing that's most visible as the number of short-term rentals increase. I would actually like to see, because this is intended to be, a home occupation in a residential area, I don't want this to be something that triggers people to ask for permit parking on their street. Right? That's probably an example of where if that happens, then the ordinance wasn't crafted right.
Right, and we'll need a revision.
But it's really, it's very difficult. 1 versus 2 cars is extremely difficult to control.
Okay.
Any other?
Well, I was just going to mention, I think in the staff report, there were 3 questions highlighted on the duration, guests and parking. We've talked about 2 of these. I personally feel 60 days seem like a good number. It's like, I can imagine someone going away for the summer and maybe just renting their home out. But so you're not going to be able to I'm actually pretty happy with 60, but I'm curious to see what the rest of my commissioners feel.
That does sound kind of somewhat optimum to me as well, just from a standpoint of I own a second home in the Sierra foothills, and I go there probably maybe 45 days a year, and so I'm not I don't do short-term rental, but I can see where that's kind of that kind of is in that ballpark. It's not every weekend, that's for sure.
So my thinking around that, again, without trying to turn this into a commercial business in a residential area, whether you would, if 60 days is not sufficient, then you would have a higher permit level that would allow you more days, but it would probably need to be a lot higher for not a lot more days. Mm-hmm. That would be something to consider. I think that's probably overkill.
Any other comments on duration?
I'm comfortable with number, but I know this number doesn't work. So it's obviously I think it's if we put some number there, we make sure this number makes sense. Mm-hmm. So far, for the number we have, it's over 60 days already, I guess. So it's for the income,
there's
right?
There's no limit.
Yeah,
right
we
now.
just there is almost no anything you can enforce this 60 days. We put there's no teeth, so you cannot enforce it. So it doesn't matter.
Well, that's where
that's my understanding.
That was
if we can figure out something we can monitoring or enforce it and have some reason why this industry need to be the 60 days or 90 days or 30 days.
Right. Well, the whole point of the third-party enforcement was, I'm assuming that the duration is one of the things they would enforce, right?
So, sorry. So, yes,
okay.
they would try to determine the number of nights per year, and based on whether they rented the whole home or just a room in the home, kind of helps you indicate whether it was hosted or unhosted. So through these avenues, and with appropriate record keeping by the host, so we can, the third party could identify things that should be looked into, and then we can then ask them for their records and to verify whether or not that is in violation.
And the platform tends to be willing to share their data?
Sorry, I misspoke when I said platform. I meant the third party. Would
Right. No, I know, but that triggered me to think, does the third party share that data willingly with the third party enforcement?
So our compliance vendor that's assisting in compliance, that's what we're paying them for. We're paying them to provide us addresses, provide us nights per year.
But they may have to go at it.
So I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's not as though Airbnb is turning over their data to our third-party
Right.
compliance. It's a mechanism of research and looking at data and
Okay.
looking at listings. So
So it's more data analytics.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Right, it's validated by the amount of TOT you collect, right?
Right.
If you're,
Yes.
then you have a sense of whether they're.
Right.
Whether,
You
know,
should be
whether
able
spot
to.
checking,
Yeah.
So any punishment for the over 60 days for the city if we impose this regulation? I assume it's that we exercise the 60 days. So if a third party reports say this particular Airbnb has violated the 60 days, so are we going to punish this
Code enforcement.
tenant?
I mean,
And then they can raise a lot of legal issues. They said, oh, I'm not over those kind of things. Going to get in trouble.
well, the whole point of this is to try to address the whole housing stock issue,
Yeah.
is to make sure that this is not becoming an issue where it affects our housing stock.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you do want to rent out a house for more than a certain amount of time, you're doing it off of a short-term rental platform.
Oh, okay.
And so that's one of the things. If you're renting out the whole house for the entire 60 days, that's not considered a short-term rental at that point, right? That's a different, you're not paying TOT on it anyway, and so that's a rental by itself. So there's different ways of addressing this particular issue, but in terms of whether the city does anything, it's just code enforcement.
Yeah.
We're just going to have to go after the host and say you've had unhosted stays of longer than 60 days, and that's really it.
If I could comment as well, I think, sorry.
No, go right ahead.
Well, I was going to say that there is no limitation on hosted stays.
Yeah.
So again, you'll find out very quickly from introducing this ordinance whether or not, I mean, if they are primarily hosted stays, then this isn't an issue. And if everybody starts yelling and screaming, then you know that maybe that 60 days needs consideration.
Right. The hosted stays being unlimited, though, does reduce the housing stock in terms of rooms for rent, right? Rooms for long-term rent.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
I just couldn't figure out how third party they impose 60 days monitoring.
Well, that's
system.
that's
That's
where our
impossible.
staff
Yeah.
is trying to figure out
Yeah.
how the third party
Yeah.
company actually does that. So I guess that was the next follow-up question I had was, what's been the experience with other local cities with regard to how many? Okay, I've got all this data from this. I'm working with this third party. They're pretty good. That's what we're going to go with. What's been their actual experience with enforcement? How many of the owners, occupants, the renters have had their license revoked and/or there's been code violations, and how much activity is generated because of non-compliance? Is that something we know?
So we don't have those numbers now, but it's something that we are looking into and trying to figure out from other cities who do have regulations, how they do that. And just as far as effectiveness of the third-party compliance vendors, it's a relatively new service that they're coming out with.
Right.
And so many people don't
I think there's a market.
Right, definitely. But a lot of the cities we've spoken to are either just starting with them or don't have much time under their belts with them to determine
Sure,
the
okay.
true effectiveness. But as far as as the uptick in complaints and issues and cases, we're reaching out to cities to determine those numbers.
All right, thanks. All right, I think we're done discussing all the elements. There's no further questions. Do
So
we
what's the
have?
issue we don't reach agreement yet? Nothing? We all good?
Sounded like the duration, we were okay. There were some
Yeah,
points
okay, yeah.
that were brought up in terms of
I can go with you 60 days.
the second point was the number of people. So that one we discussed changing that, or recommending the changing of that. And then the third point,
Parking.
parking. Yeah, that one we got wrapped around a little in terms of being difficult to actually enforce.
The only thing is that I'm still concerned is
We
about
do have a restriction, which is per the municipal code, right? Is what's written in terms of parking.
Correct. So you at least have to have as many parking spaces as is required by the municipal code for that use.
Right.
And I just want to make sure empty spaces. So a space where the owner has parked the car doesn't count.
You have to designate at least one spot as
At least one
for
spot.
short-term
Okay,
rentals
right.
and in your application.
Right, okay.
And I know Commissioner Fung asked this question about what the fee was. That's an annual fee, or is that a one-time fee?
For the permit?
Yes.
So that would be annual.
Annual. Okay. All right.
One more thing is
Yeah.
about the fire security
Mm.
things is should we just pay a little bit attention to address this for the fire safety, or is we just use the regular residential fire safety standards will be enough? Or
I
is,
assume that
or
the-
apply to the commercial fire alarm
oh.
system, the regulation. That's the only
I think
thing
that's a can of worms, but
Yeah.
We can discuss
But it's okay.
it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the philosophy here was that because this is a home occupation, then
Right. And
then
and
So
the
you just
existing
use-
home building codes apply,
Right.
and not the commercial ones.
Okay,
Right.
that's fine.
So, I think the only other thing I would say is that in the information that we record, sounded like there were a couple, probably some interesting additional information to capture there. Unfortunately, I didn't write it. This is things like how many days were you occupied? Perhaps asking how many hosted days. I don't know. I mean, it would be good, I think, for us to be able to improve our ability to understand the dynamics of who's operating and how they're operating. We want to do that to the extent that makes sense and it's not burdensome.
So, as an example, and I just wanted to tell you in terms of records that we were thinking, it is my understanding that if you logged into your Airbnb account as an operator or your VRBO account as an operator, that there is a history of transactions. And essentially when we were talking about records, we were trying to keep this as minimally burdensome as possible. So it would be simply a printout of that history or what have you for the last 3 years, that's what we would require you to keep. It wasn't so much to say, create a record of, data that you need to cure for us, essentially. So I just wanted
Okay.
to clarify that.
Yeah, I think there's generally a flavor of, I don't know whether the focus of the third party compliance vendor, if that's effectively, if that's a revenue function, that's what they're trying to improve, revenue compliance. In some respects, it's not an issue if Airbnb is collecting the money, up front, then the operator, the host can't disagree about reporting or paying. But because I think there's some valid concerns about where is this going to go as a alternative to the other kinds of housing provided, that it is useful to capture information associated with that. I think.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, just in the implementation of this ordinance, do you imagine the city making available a list of properties that have permits for short-term rentals, or?
Well, yes and no. I mean, in the sense that if you, the local contact information, we'd probably keep that available, whether it's here at City Hall, whether it's online, however. We would certainly make that information available, which will tell you which properties have that local contact, right? I mean, which property that local contact is associated with.
Okay.
So by that measure, yes, we would have a listing of all the.
But I
areas
wouldn't
that
be
are
able to
listed.
get a list of a directory of all the short-term rentals in the city.
That's what we.
That's what you would
That's
essentially
what we
get.
think we might have.
Okay.
However, we don't want to make it, available from.
public.
I mean, we don't want it to be a database for somebody, some platform provider, hosting platform to cure that data and, start
Okay.
their own whatever. And I'm not sure what the legal implications
Okay.
of that are at all. But yes, in some fashion, we do want to make some data available that is helpful to the public to identify who that local contact is and how, so we're working through that.
Right. So I'm imagining I'm a neighbor. Now I notice my neighbor. There are these strange cars coming through, and they're doing weird things. What would I do? I mean, I don't know if they just have weird relatives or they're actually renting things out. So, can you walk me through what the experience would
And
be?
that's what we're working our way through that, whether we make it available on our GIS database, here's where I live, what is we do make our building permits available online, so if this could be something that kind of goes with that.
Okay.
And it could be part of our, we have a planning permit system, which makes all planning permits available. This could be part of that, and which has the local contact information. We just don't want to make it too easy for somebody to cure that data altogether.
Okay.
So if I may, you can make it available on an as-needed basis. If I'm a resident and I see the evidence that you're identifying, then I would like to be able to call the city and say, is there a short-term rental in my neighborhood? Is this a part of the cost? And I think the city can release significant amount of information. It's already public, but there are some privacy issues in terms of what we can disclose. But remember, this is a regulatory program. The city has significant authority to set limits, to set restrictions, to require documentations, up to and including having those that want to participate certify when they come and get a permit and give you the evidence that you need. So there's a wide range of discretion that the city can impose in this program.
Thank you.
And if I could add, just if we do have this third-party vendor and with a hotline, so theoretically everyone could call this hotline and then they would identify, yes, they have an STR there, no, they don't. This is what the local contact is. It's also they would follow up with that local contact, the vendor would, and then they would follow up with the person who called them to make sure it was resolved.
So the local contacts are really for the third-party vendor. It's not for the neighbor.
It's for both.
It's for both.
It's
Okay.
for both, yeah.
All
I
right.
mean, that information could be provided to the neighbor, and it could also be utilized by the city to contact that local contact.
Okay. Thanks.
Better path would be to tell your neighbor, hey, I'm doing this and call me. But
Well, it's preferable,
Yeah.
in doing it that way where you're responsive to an area, I have an issue at this location. Here are the short-term rental operators, your hosts in that area, is better than, here is a list of all the short-term.
yeah,
Yeah.
One of the things I did want to point out is if there is an issue with a short-term rental, it almost is better if it does go through some third party or the city, because it does help document and
Yeah.
track that information, as
Right,
opposed to
that there was
having
a
that be
violation.
available. And, my neighbor's doing something, I'm
Right.
calling directly, that it doesn't get logged in as evidence for the city
Right.
to do anything down the road.
Right.
Just a thought.
good one. I think we're done.
Want a motion?
Sure. You got a motion?
Want to do it? Jerry,
You got
wanna do
everything? You got a motion?
it?
All right.
Okay. Let's see.
Yeah, let's
Well, do you want to take this off the agenda?
draft resolution.
Yeah. Okay, yes. All right. So I move that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council, is this one motion or two? Can it be one?
Well, we have the sequel part.
It's
Do you want these as one motion or two?
They're both items are included in a single resolution.
Oh,
So it would be
okay,
one,
great.
It would
one
be one
motion for
motion,
the
yeah.
resolution.
Okay, yeah, so that we find the proposed actions are exempt from CEQA and adopt an ordinance with proposed change, related to record retention to regulate short-term rental activity, and that this,
And you also want to include change the maximum
Quantity.
number of,
Yeah.
yes, that's right.
yes?
Including, I guess, is that the only substantive change at this point? Yes, to change the residential limit, or the renter limit to two per room,
2 times the number of bedrooms,
2 times the number of bedrooms.
And in the case of a studio, 2.
if the commission so pleases.
I'm just
if
curious,
that's
when there's no
motion.
bed, if you would say there was,
Yes.
right. I'd just,
Yeah.
something I don't know.
So 2 times the number of bedrooms, or 2 for a studio.
Too.
And, let's see, I believe this actually has a number, right? It's
Yeah.
MCA 2018-02.
Second?
Okay.
Motion carries 4-0 with Chair Paulson abstaining.
Okay.
Welcome, Chair, coming back.
There you, oh God, was he listening? At this point, I'd like to turn the chair back over to Commissioner Paulson. It's all yours, Jeff.
Okay, I see you behaved yourselves in my absence. Okay, a little bit, do we have any old business?
None?
Okay, do we have any new business?
None?
Okay. Do we have any staff and commission reports? Meetings you've attended, that kind of thing? Okay.
Just one sentence, congratulations for Jared Liu to win the election to be the CUSD board. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to miss working with you guys. This will, I think, be my last planning commission meeting. So I'll submit my letter of resignation after this. And I'll come back and I'll be one of the folks out there to cheer you on. Thank you.
We look forward to that. You know, I just wanted to say before I adjourn that this is the last time we probably all of us will meet together, and I've really enjoyed this commission. I've served about 14 years on different commissions, and without casting aspersions on any other commission, this is the best that I've served on. So I really appreciate you folks, and all of you are smarter than me, and you're civil and prepared and smile and laugh and are congenial, and I really appreciate it. I think we've done some good work and had some good discussions. So with that, adjourn.
Thank you.